Hey Arthur.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Arthur. I head up the content and syndication and social media department at Prime Media Online. Um, in terms of the content syndication space, at least, it's a funny space in with regards to content, obviously being a high commodity sort of item. A lot of people need content on their websites. We have a lot of clients who we syndicate content to on a sort of daily basis for them to kind of just fill their platforms up, really. Um, there's kind of another kind of aspect to the whole content syndication thing when we start to take it into a more strategic conversation, strangely enough. So when we're talking about content syndication, the brands that seem to go for it are those who have sponsorships, for example, and they just want to put on content which is usually quite newsworthy and not quite the evergreen type. But when we talk to brands about curating content, for example, they seem to be quite reticent about that in a content marketing sense. One of the sort of the pushbacks that they always have is that they don't really want to send consumers away from their own platforms. But I think it's one of those things that we need to kind of get around eventually from an industry perspective. Naz, so from a content perspective, Nazreen, sorry, from a content syndication perspective, is that the sort of line that you want me to go down?
Yes, please. I mean, I was thinking content syndication because we've got a very mixed crowd in the room. So
Yeah.
small business, digital agency owners, digital professionals, and I think the thing is also to understand what content means. You know, is it the written word? Is it a podcast? It is some kind of multimedia content? Or what do you mean by content? And working in a large organization, tell us about your experience with that, so
Okay,
that we can learn from those experiences.
Sure. And look, I mean, one of the sort of the things that drives the content syndication is, generally speaking, the sort of where we are with the technology side of things. So a lot of our requests come in for editorial type of content, primarily because I think brands are a bit sort of worried about data, about downloads of video.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting watching Mike's presentation earlier, because that sort of, you know, the uptake of YouTube and the way YouTube's growing in South Africa tends to kind of dispel that data myth, and maybe it doesn't exist anymore. We are seeing a lot more kind of video content being taken up in terms of content strategy and content marketing. But from a syndication perspective, I don't think there's a lot that happens in terms of video. It does tend to be editorial content. It does tend to be things like live sports events, news, maybe sort of lifestyle type featurey news. That's the sort of stuff that people seem to want to syndicate and put on their platforms. One of the things that we're finding actually is that a lot of brands don't have a monetization strategy for their syndication or for the content. And I think a lot of brands fall into this trap of literally just publishing content for the sake of publishing content because they actually think that that will achieve a business objective. When we start to talk about content in any sort of area, in any facet, from a brand perspective, and even from a publisher perspective, we really are talking about it as a way to achieve business goals or marketing objectives that tie into business goals. But I think there is this kind of misconception. Content marketing is a publishing thing. You know, publish a lot of content, and people will turn up to your portal or your blog or wherever it is that you're publishing content, and they'll consume that content and build a relationship with your brand and eventually buy stuff from you, because that's ultimately what the point is. Yeah. But very seldom does that actually work in that sense. A lot of the brands sort of eventually realize that content marketing is a content based marketing activity. So it's marketing first. So when we start to syndicate content to a lot of sort of big publishers in the country, people like Yahoo, MSN, all utilize our content. What we find is that at the end of the day, there isn't actually a firm content plan or a sort of marketing plan in place to try and utilize this content to try and push consumers down a sales funnel or whatever it is that they use as a monetization strategy. From a publisher perspective. Sorry. From a publisher perspective, it's an easy one, because publishers traditionally make their money off advertising, which means that the more eyeballs they have, the more pages viewed, the more money they can generate. So in that sense, that when they syndicate content, you can easily kind of correlate, okay, they've paid X rand for a piece of content, that piece of content had 200 people view it, and they sell their banner space for X amount. So you can start to sort of get some maths on that. But when we start to talk about brands syndicating content, it starts to become quite a difficult kind of a difficult one to pin down in terms of the value of that content.
Okay, brilliant. I think the one question that I have that comes to mind before we go to audience questions is, let's just go back to the basic idea of syndication. So there are a lot of people sitting in the room who are small businesses or wanting to understand content strategy, may not necessarily speak to a digital professional like us. I'm going to say like us. I am believing I am one also. So I'm talking about syndication. Tell us what that means. And I want to know also, if you're producing a piece of content, I'm a freelance writer, I then give that to a magazine or to an online portal. It's not my content anymore, as far as I know, in terms of legalities, if you're signing it away. And then what happens to that? How can you monetize that for your brand, especially? So for a small business, can you tell us a bit more about that?
Okay, so if you're a small business, one of the things if we go back a step, it's important to kind of make a distinction between content syndication and content curation. Again, Mike sort of touched on the content curation. Unfortunately, I wasn't privy to the other sessions, but it may have been tackled. The content curation effectively is curating other people's content onto your platforms, and they click through to wherever you're curating. So a lot of what we do on social media, in particular on Twitter, is content curation. When you retweet something, when you tweet someone's link, that's content curation. Syndication really is when you use other people's content and you buy the rights to that content to put on your platforms, and it remains on your platforms in a way. So from a rights perspective, a lot of content syndication doesn't give you the rights to that content if you're buying that content. A lot of times you can't own the content, is what I mean. You literally have a right to reproduce some of it. So don't expect that you can buy a piece of content, do what you like with it, put it wherever you want, and then and that's within the frameworks of that agreement. These agreements generally are very kind of they're very legal heavy, and they need quite clear stipulation. I mean, with our clients, we make sure that we know exactly where the content's going to end up, how they're going to monetize it, how they're going to track, how they're going to measure. So we keep an eye on this stuff, because what you can't have is a brand buying your content, selling it on somewhere else as a third party, or passing it on in other areas. So it's important to be kind of smart with the content. From a small business perspective, I think content syndication is a tough one to make work for you as a small business, unless of course you're a publisher and you can directly monetize that content. Far more important, if you're a small business, is to have a very strategic and very carefully planned content marketing program. Now, if you do a content marketing program, obviously the crux of that and the core of that is content. So where do you get your content from? That's one of the things that brands really grapple with right now. There are a lot of ways to do this. You can sort of, as I say, you can curate a lot of content. You can find publishing partners, for example. But critically, you have to think about the content from a consumer perspective. And again, this ties back and sort of to keep going back to Mike's points. I think Mike stole a lot of the points I was going to make. But it really is becoming more and more a consumer-focused area, digital media that is, from a content perspective. So as consumers, we don't really consume content that isn't relevant to us, that doesn't matter to us, or that doesn't add value in some way. Now, a lot of brands don't get that wrong, and small businesses don't get that don't get that right even, and small businesses don't get that right. There is this tendency to just publish content to try and create thought leadership, for example, rather than really think about what content relates to your brand and adds value to your consumer, to your potential target market, and then starting to focus on that particular content and hone in on that. What we're seeing a lot of, especially in the US, which is probably about 5 or 6 years ahead in terms of content marketing, is brands starting to go down the route of quality versus quantity. So whereas sort of 3-4 years ago in the States, brands were just publishing masses of content. I mean, if you look at Pepsi have a content marketing portal, I think it's called Pepsi Live, and that used to be just a load of very good published content, but en masse. There was a lot of content that was being published. Now we look at some sort of some portals like, it's called Nowness. I don't know if you guys have heard of LVMH. It's the luxury brand, but it's a holding company. And you'll see they might publish one post a day, but the focus is on the quality, not the quantity, which is really ultimately what consumers sort of go for. And in fact, it would be interesting actually if we go around the room and ask people in the audience now how many pieces of content they fully consume per day. And I think you'll sort of get a steer. It's not going to be a huge amount. In between your work, generally, you're not going to do more than 3 or 4 pieces of content maximum if you really sort of go out. And that's away from published content, like, for example, reading the BBC or Times Live or your own industry press. So away from that, brands are going to really struggle to reach consumers with content. So when they do, it really needs to be very, very relevant to that consumer. So they need to get to know their consumer really well and make sure that the content they publish is relevant to them, rather than focusing on getting in as much content as they can that they think the consumer wants. Because we all have a lot of media and digital touch points. Everyone in the room probably has 10, 15, 20 different sites that they might be plugged into on a daily basis. So how do brands reach us? And I think the key to that, it really is valuable content.
I think you're absolutely right. An example that comes to mind immediately of one which I saw recently on Vine is the Chanel channel. Chanel, very high luxury brand. I don't know how to describe it, but the quality of their videos, and I think Vine videos are 6 seconds each, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
6. So if you look at the quality of their ads, I don't know. I just keep what I suppose that's Vine. It loops continuously, but it's just beautiful to watch. Very mesmerizing, especially Chanel ads. So I understand what you're saying when you're talking about quality content. But to nearly round up this session, I'd like to take some questions from the audience. Anyone? Content marketing? Before I think they want to have a coffee and obviously head out from here. But any questions, guys? Kath? Not at the moment. Anything else you'd like to round up the session with Arthur about content marketing? Because I know at our next social media evening, I'd like to have you talk a little bit more in depth, but Kath is going to scoot over this way and ask you a question quick. Hold on.
Hello, Arthur. We met earlier. How are you doing?
Hello.
Good. I actually wanted to ask you a bit of a devil's advocate question. What do you think is the most awful content marketing mistake someone can make? Like the biggest crime in this industry.
One of the, we very recently did a content marketing sort of strategy session or workshop with a big telecoms operator, and when we first got to the session, there were about sort of 6 or 7 marketing people in the room, 2 or 3 of us, and a couple of sort of others here and there. And they were looking to publish this blog that is designed to kind of have consumer engagement and just kind of build up a relationship, because they're seen as quite stale, quite sort of, they don't really have a persona or personality in the marketplace. One of the first things that one of the marketing directors asked us was, how many press releases can I put onto this blog every day? And I think that was their starting point. How many press releases can we put on this? So it was kind of, I knew we were in for a long haul as soon as that sort of question came in, and you can sort of get the sense of where they were at. But I think that's where a lot of brands are. One of the issues that we have is, so content marketing, it concerns itself with publishing content that is interesting to consumers, but actually in a marketing capacity. So when you give it to publishers, what publishers do is they publish content which consumers want. So they don't actually have a marketing strategy behind it. But then the flip side is when you give it to marketers, which is where content marketing traditionally sits in South African organizations, they have a marketing focus, so they don't actually think about the consumer. So I think the biggest problem with content marketing, or the biggest danger, is going out to market and either speaking about yourself as a brand, because consumers don't actually care about the brand, really. Very, very few brands consumers actually care about. So it is that brands get stuck in that kind of ego thing. We are great, our products are brilliant. Why should consumers not want to know about our products and our discounts? And I think that's the biggest problem and the biggest challenge for brands, is to try and overcome that and actually speak to the consumers on a consumer level.
Thanks for that. It's that whole element of making your brand human, but not making your brand, I don't want to say God of their own world, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a really fine balance, and it takes a lot of skill actually, which for us it's a concern in the content marketing space in South Africa, because what you have is brands that try content marketing get it wrong because they haven't actually invested in getting expertise in to do it, and then thinking that content marketing actually doesn't work, whereas really they just didn't do it properly. So that's one of our challenges where we are now.
Okay, brilliant. Any final words for us before we leave you, Arthur?
No, if you're thinking about getting into content marketing, and if you're sort of focusing on trying to build relationships with consumers, then the best way I'd put it, and I say this to all of our clients, is you really need to adopt an outside-in kind of approach. So put yourself in the consumer's shoes, and only publish things that you think the consumer's interested in. And then think about things as if you were the consumer. Is this piece of content interesting to a consumer? If it's not, don't publish it. Just don't publish it. It's got to be quality stuff, and it's got to be relevant.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much for your time. I know we've battled to get you also because you've been manic between a million clients, and I called you this morning. You were running like between 5 meetings.
Oh, it's always the case, but we'll make the time.
Can we get a round of applause for Arthur? Arthur, have an awesome evening, and this broadcast will go live almost immediately. So we'll catch you soon, and I hope to have you here at our next social media evening live.
I hope to be there. Cheers, Nas.
Okay, great.
Bye.
Good night.